Hello, America. I'm Dr. Environment, and on today's episode, we are joined by two environmentally impassioned people who claim to have been around since the 1780s. On the Federalist side, we have Mrs. Ambiente advocating for the anti-Federalists. We have Mr. Horrible. Having very different approaches to climate legislation, they are here today to discuss climate legislation through the lenses of Federalists and anti-Federalists. So, Mrs. Ambiente, you are a strong advocate for Federalist policy in regards to the environment. Can you tell us why this should be a national issue?
My main argument about why these environmental issues should be a Federalist issue is because they can spread across state lines. According to Meredith Medaway at MIC, things such as mercury emissions, pollution, and greenhouse gases can travel far into different states, especially in waterways such as rivers and lakes, which can carry pollutants that can pass through and touch many other states. So therefore, if the water is polluted in New Mexico, it can flow through the Rio Grande to affect Texas. This shows that if one state fails to create good environmental policies, it can negatively impact other states as well. Also, the quality of state environmental mandates can depend on the success of the state. Many states are already having to depend upon federal funding. According to an article by Brookings, if a state is more prosperous and has more money, then it is going to be better at creating and enforcing new policies, and providing resources that can help them to do so, especially because their funds are probably being used more for issues such as Medicaid and other welfare, and are less likely to get more money through borrowing and expanding taxes. For my next argument, which is supported by the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, greenhouse gases and climate change are a global issue. Therefore, it is best to try and combat this at a national level. National governments are more likely to be educated on the issue and attend conferences, such as with the UN. Also, it's better to have one national representative to work with other nations to help reduce climate change. Lastly, the Constitution directly grants the federal government the ability to regulate the environment through the Necessary and Proper Clause, granting it the ability to legislate over pressing issues such as the environment.
Very well said, Ms. Ambiente. You're going to have to make quite the argument to refute that, Mr. Horrible, so what do you have to say?
Hello, mates. This is Captain Crunch. If crunch berries are a fusion of crunch and berryness, which came first, the berrylicious crunch or the crunchalicious berry? The crunch is calling. Try my Crunch Berry cereal.
Thanks for having me on, Dr. Environment. Ms. Ambiente may think this is the best approach to this situation, but as usual, those Federalists are as ignorant as ever. The problem here is that the environmental issues affect states in very unique ways. Washington, D.C. may know they want environmental legislation, but they don't personally experience the heat waves of the South, the droughts of the West, or the heavy flooding and snowfall that happens further up north. For example, if Washington wants renewable energy so they push heavily for solar energy, this could hurt the economies of states that already use other renewable energies like wind turbines in Texas. It's also not as if states are not willing to regulate their own environment. For example, the Preservation Leadership Forum talks about this when listing pieces of successful state-level environmental legislation. The California Environmental Quality Act, for example, forces companies and organizations to run environmental analysis of their decisions before they impact it with construction. Alternatively, the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act, quote, requires state and local governments to routinely propose legislation mitigating the environmental impact of their activities. Even if you don't buy that state governments are capable of dealing with their own issues, the honest truth is that they have to be. The federal government is constantly in fluctuation of how much the environment is protected, depending on which way Congress and the president decides. This is not to mention that the Supreme Court recently weakened the Environmental Protection Act, losing the ability for the federal government to adequately reduce emissions. The Columbia Climate School sums up the argument by saying, quote, without rules and adequate infrastructure, our communities will become less healthy places to live. State and local governments have no choice but to keep our waste out of the ocean and poison out of our water supply. The federal government simply cannot cater to the needs of individual states.
Well, I disagree. And I think that the federal government actually should be in charge of implementing these policies, because when a state is trying to cater to their own needs, such as you said, they could easily cut corners, such as if they excel in a certain industry, then they could avoid putting any environmental regulations on that industry so that they can best succeed in it, even if it means creating more pollutants or releasing more greenhouse gases.
Both the federal and state governments have the potential to cut corners, though. Not to mention that the Constitution doesn't specifically mention environmental legislation, so that grants the states the ability to deal with it under the 10th Amendment.
Settle down, Mr. Horrible. So viewers, you've all had the chance to hear both sides of the story. Should the national government or state government decide on the environmental issues of the country? The Federalists say that the national government should control environmentals because of the difference in states' policies and levels of protection towards the environment, while the anti-federalists believe it should all be controlled by the individual states because the national government doesn't personally experience the different issues of each state. Now that just about wraps it up for us here at the Climate Convention, and on today's episode we learned about the perspectives of both anti-federalists and federalists on who should control the environment. Thanks for joining us today. Signing off for Climate Convention, I'm Dr. Environment.
And I'm Miss Ambiante.
And I'm Mr. Horgel.
I'm the host, and this is over. Now.